So, my particular choice for this particular evening of a tremendous Talmid Chacham that really inspired many generations to come was the Ramban. We have to say, to be fair, that he is probably not as well known or as extensively studied today as he used to be, because his writings are a bit more cryptic. Such is the nature of the Ramban. The Rambam troubles himself, Maimonides, who preceded him by over 100 years, probably took all the pains and the efforts that he could to make his writings understandable and to make them accessible and to bring Torah down to the level that people could appreciate and understand it. Not that it was light in content. He certainly wrote, in the Guide to the Perplexed Moreh Nevuchim, he wrote many deep and difficult concepts to understand, but his philosophy was pretty straightforward and I hate to use the word rational because I think it has too many secular consequences. At the end of the day, he believes in miracles, he believes in angels, believes that Kadosh Baruch Hu created the world. So, but he has a perhaps slightly more rational way of explaining and passing things on to his disciples, to the reader. The Ramban makes no such pretensions. He doesn't attempt, for example, to find philosophical explanations or justifications for what he says. Really pretty key in understanding the difference between the two, because there were some very famous, you can't really fairly call them machlokot, because the Ramban lived way past at least over 100 years after the Rambam had passed away. So you can call it a machloket, but the Rambam never got a chance to defend himself, so it was effectively the Ramban disputing how the Rambam held. So he's also, just so you know, and for your general information, probably the earliest example, or at least one of the 2 or 3 earliest examples we have, of a more Kabbalistically inclined commentary. And the reason that's a little bit difficult to ascertain is because it wasn't very popular at all in this particular time period. He's born at the very end of the 12th century and lived through most of the 13th century.
Where did he live?
In Spain. In Girona. He's referred to as Gironde, like from... I don't know where the D comes from. Yeah, but they say Gironde is what they called it in Hebrew amongst themselves, or maybe in Catalan.
In Kabbalah, when does it go? I mean, when you say it was one of the first one, I mean...
So this is actually a whole discussion, and he's one of the central figures in it. So it was not popular at this time. The Zohar had not been mass-produced or printed or published. It was just the kind of thing that was kept secret amongst those who were privy to it. And so, for example, he very harshly criticizes the Rambam on more than one occasion, and basically says that, his criticisms are along the lines of, had you had access to, or had you learned from a master who was initiated in, these deeper secrets of the Torah, you might not have written this, or he never would have said that, or he wouldn't have done this. The Rambam certainly doesn't make such claims. He wrote the whole Moreh Nevuchim as his explanation for the secrets of the Torah, which is also very deep and very difficult to understand. But the Ramban begins with the understanding that there are things that are beyond our understanding, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't owe us a logical or rational explanation for anything. And in fact, the entire area of secrets of the Torah, these are things that basically you wouldn't know them if they hadn't been revealed to you. You wouldn't have access to them. There's no way even a normal Rav would teach this to you if he didn't think that you were worthy of it. Just the way the nature of the Torah being transmitted this way. And he makes such comments. Rabbi Abraham ben Ezra writes something similar on every so often, and they were pretty much contemporary. So it's not new to him, a little older than maybe. But it's not new to us. Looking in this modern perspective, in the ancient perspective, it really was a very unique point of view to have, where he was probably one of, if not the first, who actually came out and said, guess what? I have access to this tradition. I learned from my Rabbanim. We have such a concept as this Chokhmah, these Sodot. They didn't use the term Kabbalah necessarily to describe much more. Literally, Kabbalah just means a tradition in Hebrew. It doesn't mean more than that. So he describes this, and he says that we have such secrets, we have allusions, indications to things that are beyond our human comprehension, and one should be so fortunate as to be able to access this information. It's not the kind of thing that you can understand rationally. It's not the kind of thing that you can deduce or conclude on your own. If you're fortunate enough that someone opens your eyes, you great, and if not, then not. One good example of this, the Ramban writes about the Sa'ir al-Azazel. Very difficult concept to understand. The scapegoat, Buk Emisya, by Yom Kippur. And he writes that you'll see an indication of this by Rabbi Abraham ben Ezra, who kind of wrote a hint to this. If you look at the birds of the Metzorah has to bring, someone who suffers from Metzorah has to basically bring two birds. One of them is dipped in blood, and one of them is slaughtered, and the blood is captured, and then the other one is dipped in the blood, but you let it go. So it's a sacrifice, it's not really sacrificed, and he goes on a whole long explanation of this. Basically, he puts the pieces together, and he says, okay, if Rabbi Abraham ben Ezra was too too modest to reveal this, I'll put the pieces together for you. Because he says, like, if this is a secret that you'll understand when you're, I think it was 38 or something, and he just says, it's a reference to Pasuk Lamed, and if you look there, you'll see this whole connection, how he makes a very, very deep connection between the Sa'ir al-Azazel and the two birds of the Metzorah. Just like in Yom Kippur, we sacrifice one goat the way you normally would, and then there's one that's pushed off a cliff. One goes to Hashem, one goes to whatever Azazel is. Not Chas v'Shalom, another deity, but something we're commanded to do. And he says, so too you'll find a connection between these two, and go figure it out. Only so much I can say about this in writing. So the Ramban himself was also a tremendous student of philosophy, and he made some very bombastic statements, or maybe even achievements, I would say, in the realm of Jewish philosophy. One of them was that in his time it already became, he was living through the Muslim age in Spain, where the Catholics were starting to fight back. In other words, the Muslims came and just overwhelmed them. There wasn't all that much they could do about it. And in his time, the Catholics living in Spain, who had a certain degree of autonomy, really began to religiously oppress the Jews there. It wasn't just, you're not like us, you're not ethnically Spanish, so we're upset about it. It was more, you killed Jesus and you should really repent and you should become Christians. So one of his famous disputations, and he had a few, was with a famous apostate by the name of Pablo Cristiani, a Jewish guy who had actually studied Torah. He had a student, a famous student named Avner, who also ended up converting to Catholicism, which is actually pretty frightening, because if you had a Rav like the Ramban and you managed to get lost, that's again, we're back to that expression, if the cedars are on fire, what does the Zatar say? How much can we do about this? But it was a famous story. And in his dispute with Pablo Cristiani, he basically, he said, okay, no problem, give me 3 days to prepare the New Testament. So I've never read it. And I'll be happy to entertain this dispute. There was a panel naturally slanted towards the Catholics. And Ramban went through it, and he very famously questioned a lot of these Christian concepts. And one of them was, he said, so you believe this was the Mashiach, and you believe that he fulfilled all the prophecies in Yeshaya and Zechariah that describe the Mashiach and the end of time. And he said, so this is your Messianic era, or the post-Messianic era? So are there in fact no more plagues? Are we done with disease? Is there no more poverty or ignorance or war? He said, if anything, these things have actually grown quite a bit since Jesus lived, which is a very gutsy thing to say in front of a Catholic audience. But he said, if anything, these wars have only become more prominent. We've had the Black Plague and the bubonic plague. I mean, it's not like any of these prophecies have been fulfilled at all. The dead have yet to be resurrected, and the world is in a state of absolute chaos. And you claim that this is the fulfillment of prophecy. You claim that this is actually what the prophets would have described. So on that note, it was determined that the Ramban had won the debate, but it was also decided that he must have had help from the Satan and he had to leave Spain. That's a typical Catholic response to a Catholic problem. There's an issue, that's okay, it's just the devil. If the devil weren't there, everything would be okay. So he was exiled. He ended up going to Eretz Yisrael. He gave some famous drashot in Akko before he passed away. But the Arizal points to him as one of the great-grandfathers of the Kabbalistic revolution of the 15th century. So he basically has, it's a very interesting concept, he writes that according to the Kabbalistic tradition, all of the Tanaim and all of the Amoraim, without exception, were all well aware of the mystical tradition. And by the Geonim already he says some of them were and some of them weren't. When it comes to the Rishonim, he said the tradition was basically relatively weak. There were only a few who actually had access to it, and many who doubted or questioned it, or just didn't get all that involved. And he mentions the Ramban as like the real torchbearer of this particular mystical tradition in a time when it was almost lost. There was a few already from him. It's about 100 years later that the Zohar Kadosh was printed, and that the study of Kabbalah was once again undertaken in relatively, not in public, but at least the discussions once again took place. So the Ramban and his disciples really held on very tightly to this tradition. In fact, Rabbeinu Yonah Migirondi, who commented on Pirkei Avot, also had this mystical approach to things. He was the first one. It was actually the Ran, Rabbeinu Nisim, a little bit before them. But he was so Rabbeinu Nisim, who also lived in Spain, was the first one who writes openly about reincarnation. For example, before the Zohar was published, before it was made more public, he writes about this in his Drashot of Rosh Hashanah, Drashot Haran. If you look it up, he writes this is a mighty and awesome secret that was revealed to me by my grandfather. He says how it's entirely possible that because of whatever reason, for whatever unfinished business, that neshama should be reincarnated, should be brought back to Olam Hazeh in order to finish what was started. He brings a few allusions to this from the Gemara. So basically, this is the school of thought. It's not that Torah began and ended with the Talmud, but rather that there's a whole mystical tradition that goes even beyond this, and that it helps to explain some of the inexplicable.
Nowhere in the Gemara, because you said Tanaim and Noraim they knew already, but nowhere in the Gemara do they even make like some hints
To what?
to like this tradition,
To reincarnation in particular? Or
in particular, in general, like it was like all knowledge that they have, but you say like
look in Masechet Chagiga. The whole second chapter, Masechet Chagiga, talks about this.
okay.
It's one of the few places where the Gemara itself actually speaks about the mystical tradition. The Perek begins with. These are some of the famous quotations and sources that are quoted. Now the Perek begins with, it's called Perek En Megalin, because the Mishnah begins, En Megalin Rozei Torah, Ela Mishu Chacham Mavin Mida'ato, En Dorshin Ba'arayot, En Dorshin is not, En Dorshin Ba'arayot. We don't study the intricate details of Arayot, so some of Roshim understand like the technical details of the forbidden sexual relations, and some understand the deeper meaning behind it. Like if HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world in His image, why are some of us male and some of us female? And how come there's so many mitzvot in the Torah that relate to sexual interdictions? So what does it teach us about the creation? What does it teach us? So clearly it's a very deep topic. The Mishnah goes on and says that we don't study Maaseh Bereshit or Maaseh Merkava unless you're, someone who's exceptionally knowledgeable, and we don't really reveal the secrets of the Torah unless someone is really, promising and able to understand or to deduce certain things on his own. And then you have easily 4 or 5 more dapim that go on and talk about these secrets, different psukim that clearly don't mean what it is that they say, and explanations of what it is they're referring to. So you have plenty of references in the Gemara. It's something that people very often confuse when they're talking about the Kabbalistic tradition. They just assume that this all began with the Zohar. Masechet Sanhedrin, at the end of the 3rd chapter, the Gemara talks about how the Amoraim used to create Golmim on Shabbat. Not the Maharal Prague. This isn't. Sefer Yetzirah is mentioned in the Gemara. It's referred to, and so they said that on Shabbat in the afternoon, especially, they would learn from Sefer Yetzirah, this very terse discussion of the creation. It reads like a Mishnayot, Sefer Yetzirah, but it talks about Sefirot. It describes Sefirot. So they used to create these Golmim. Sometimes it was hard to tell if it was a real person or not, but apparently if he wasn't so good at talking, they would just kill him and make another one. like what I do when I'm bored. Right?
Funny afternoon.
Yeah, it's basically their equivalent of like Monopoly, you know,
He's on the bed.
creating people
Yeah.
and throwing them back in the pile. Right. Bolot, there you go. It's like a pinnacle. So the Gemara makes reference to these things. It doesn't tell you how to do it. It just tells you that such a thing exists. That such a thing is actually possible. You have other references to these things, just not super explicitly. In other words, the Gemara will tell you that it's possible, but won't necessarily tell you how. Kishafim also appears pretty much everywhere. A lot of it in Masechet Sanhedrin, a little bit in Masechet Avodah Zarah, where you have discussions about them doing these supernatural things.
But even in the Torah, we have, even in the Chamisha Kamshei Torah, we have allusion about this.
Oh, so the difference between let's say the Pashtanim and the Mekubalim, the Pashtanim believe that these capabilities no longer exist. The Mekubalim would tell you it's not impossible to do, just it's very expensive. It costs you lots of merits and it's dangerous and we don't do these things anymore so much. But actually, if you really want to push the point, I don't know that now's necessarily the time, but it's clear that from the Gemara that Yimach Shem Zichro, that Yeshua Notzari was at some point anyway, or up to a certain point, was availed of some of this knowledge. The Gemara describes things that he did himself. Doesn't talk about healing someone with tzara, doesn't talk about turning water into wine, doesn't talk about walking on water or resurrecting the dead. It talks about his ability to do certain things. And that it was a result of kishu, for using certain names of Hashem in appropriate places at appropriate times. But anyway, so it's there. The Ramban was one of the very, very early advocates. I mean, he would talk about this at a time where it wasn't very public wasn't very popular or common to discuss it in public. Part of the reason must have been because he was, again, only a few generations after the Rambam, and the Rambam wanted to maintain that everything has a rational explanation to it. And so if you'd like to understand the Torah on a deeper level, you really have to work on your intellect. You have to work on your knowledge, you have to work on your understanding, and you need to study these things in depth and try to figure things out. And the Ramban's response is, if this is what drives you to find philosophically rational explanations for things, I challenge you to explain the inexplicable. There are certainly things that you can't explain with rationale, and the alternative is not secular philosophy, or I don't have to explain or justify my tradition to the secular philosophers or the rationalists. We have another tradition which is deeper than the rest of this, and he favors this. If you look throughout the Torah, he really, in his Pirush al Torah, for example, he writes some very deep, very, very complicated items that are sort of hard to understand otherwise, but he's pretty emphatic about it. And at the same time, it's not like he's ignorant of the Pshat either. He just writes, a couple of famous Pirushim, for example, he writes about Paro. We mentioned before how, first of all, he didn't have to volunteer to do something. Even though Hashem told Abraham prophetically this was going to happen, he can still be punished for fulfilling a prophecy that Hashem gave us, because he was in no way required to volunteer in order to fulfill it. And he also writes famously about free will, about Bichra Chofshit. And he writes that Paro in the beginning had it and eventually lost it. And when Hashem tells Moshe that he's going to harden his heart, what he means is that he had free will and he exaggerated. He went so far that even his free will is not going to be challenged. But if you look at the Ramban, he's very emphatic, for example, by Adam and Hawa and the Nachash, that we're not talking about simple beings. He describes the creation, where if you look carefully in Maaseh Bereshit, you'll find Vayivra, Elokim et Taninim Agdolim, for example. You have Vayitzer and Vayas. So he describes this famously. Zohar Kodesh talks a lot about these four different spheres of reality: Atzilut, Birya, Yetzira, Asiyah. If you look at the Sidur, we map out the Tefillah from the Korbanot to Olam Asiyah. Next up is Olam Yetzira, Birya, and then Atzilut. So he describes this, and he says, if you look at the creation itself, another famous Pirush of his, you'll find that the entire creation was abstract and didn't become physical until the Chet. That's a chidush all unto his own. He writes like this, that if you look carefully, it sounds like the Torah is repeating the story of the creation. He says, this is where they actually were planted in Gan Eden. That only came after everything else. Everything else was like bechoach, it was potential, it was abstract. They didn't exactly have bodies. And when Hashem says, "Vayastem kotnot or b'shem," he holds it to be. This is where Hashem actually gave them skin. In other words, they weren't just neshamot. Now they were actually people created the way that you and I have skin and what have you. So it's powerful interpretations. But he has tremendous chidushim. He is by no means called into question by anyone. It's not like anyone claims the Ramban was wrong about any of his pirushim. They're perfectly accepted like any other. In other words, no one has any issue with the fact that he just happens to be a Kabbalist and happens to be a strong proponent of Kabbalistic literature. At the same time, you should know that even in Pshat, he was very accepted as a posek too. So he wrote some very landmark teshuvot in Kashrut, in Chot Nida, a few other places that we basically accept. His tendency, incidentally, was another one that you'll find is very common theme by the Mekubalim, which he tends to be strict. Where the Rambam was accused by many of being lenient, because if you have a machloket in the Gemara, he'll tell you, so my understanding is the machloket ends up, like this or like that. We don't have to be sensitive to both opinions. He holds this as kosher, he holds this isn't, so we can hold sometimes like this or sometimes like that. The Rambam wasn't looking to be strict or to be lenient. The Ramban actually does look to be strict, which is interesting. You'll find this later, much later by the Ashkenazim, in the Chassidut. You're familiar with the Chassidim, so you think, as good an example as any would be Chabad. Chabad is in no way halachically lenient. I don't know if you're aware of this. They're open. They have all kinds of interesting people with piercing and tattoo and all sorts of hair formations, but the reality is that their actual level of halachic practice is extremely strict, way beyond what's required by halacha. Think Pesach, that they eat matzah with nothing else on the table. They eat it with gloves. They don't eat avocado or tomatoes or anything with any moisture with the matzah. Clearly, this is not halacha. But they're super strict about it. They're super strict about Shabbat. They're super strict about a lot of different things. And at the same time, a lot of the teachings that they base the movement on are profoundly Kabbalistic. So it's not like they're just looking to be strict, meaning they believe that the mitzvot should be done in the most ideal, perfect way, beyond reproach. No one should be able to claim, I didn't fulfill the mitzvah, like I fulfilled it according to all opinions. And they hold this way. The Ben Ish Chai was very similar in Baghdad. He adopted a lot of Ashkenazi customs just so as to be strict and not to even enter in what could potentially be a machloket, because why? My purpose is to come as close as I can to God. Why take the chance? Even if halakha is not this way, even if the tradition by the Sephardim is not this way, he said, go ahead, do it. What does it cost you? What do you lose?
No, but you don't need anyone to. You don't need anyone to tell you that. If you always is the worst opinion, just like you don't need. If someone can come to say this, you can. But if you want to take the worst, you want to do the worst every time, you don't need any teachers to tell you that you just take what's the worst opinion in the machloket, and it becomes your.
The Ramban probably is one of the earliest examples of someone who says, look, here in Spain we have a tradition. The tradition is not like I'm about to tell you, but I think it would be great if you were to adopt something else. Not very popular by the purists. I don't know how that would go over in Italy, for example. Come and say, no, we have a tradition, but we're going to do something else because, a very respectable rabbi wrote this about the other thing. One example of this in the Ktav, in the writing. He changed a little bit some of the details of the print they had in Spain. It's not like no one knew how to write Sifrei Torah in Spain. But he writes, we should make the Nun Sofi the way the Ashkenazim do, like a Zayin, like a long Zayin, instead of making it like a long Nun. So he quotes a source. The Ramban probably is, if I'm not mistaken, the first one who said that the Sephardim should stop cooking liquids on Shabbat. Because the Rashba and the Rambam said it's okay. The Teimanim to this day, you ever been to a Teimani house on Shabbat? Don't go, it's scary. They take water, they boil it before Shabbat, they take it off the fire off the plata, and then on Shabbat, you want a cup of coffee, just put it back on the plata, let it get hot, and you make your coffee or your tea. So it's perfectly okay. The Gemara seems to imply that it's clearly this.
It's like glowing yellow.
So yeah, and they pray to a different God. It's not like. So clearly, what they're doing is the Gemara says "En bishul achar bishul." No such thing as cooking after cooking, and the traditional Sephardi understanding, just so you know, we were all doing this up until not too long ago. And the Ramban was the first one who said, you know what? We should be careful for this concept, because how do you cook water? You boil it and then it cools off, then you have to boil it again. So maybe by water, the only way to cook it is to heat it up, and when it's cold, it can still be recooked and you can be punished for it. The Rambam doesn't hold this way, the Rasha doesn't hold this way. He wanted to be strict. So yeah, it's okay, sure, no problem. Why don't we be a little bit extra cautious or extra careful? And from that point on, it becomes already fashionable to adopt minhagim that aren't even from your community, in order to account for opinions that are someone else's, but legitimate or important, or worthwhile anyway in his opinion. Up until then, it was very unpopular to adopt minhagim from outside the community. We have a tradition. You have this concept of what's called hotzat la'az al rishonim. You're casting aspersions on the earlier generations. Today the mikvaot are 8 times bigger than they used to be. Why? Because none of our grandmothers went to a kosher mikveh. So it's popular, it's fashionable, it's easy. So okay, but it makes the previous generations look bad when you do things like this. When you change the tradition, you say we should write the nun sofit like this. Why? All sifrei Torah that were written in Spain were no good. I mean, is that what you're trying to say? No, not that they were no good, but they could be better.
Yeah, we hear a lot this kind of stuff.
Today this is very popular.
For every subject,
Today this is super popular. So there's a consequence to doing things like this. In his case, probably more out of chassidut than anything else. He just wants to, where he sees a potential danger, either if Sefer Torah shouldn't be as perfectly kosher as it can be, or that Shabbat shouldn't be as perfectly observed as it could be, he'll accommodate other opinions, even if some of them are a little bit influenced by Ashkenazim, about Tosafot, for example. It was less uncommon by him than it was by other poskim. But tremendous Kabbalistic insights. His Pirush HaTorah is absolutely obligatory. I mean, there's no way you can call yourself Baki in the Chumash without knowing the Ramban's Pirushim on the Chumash itself. They're very deep and hard to understand, but it's a very unique perspective. And he's the one who really popularized explaining even to the masses certain Kabbalistic concepts, or giving them access to deeper ideas that up until then were kind of kept somewhat secret and under the radar, so to speak. So, Shakochem, God's help, we'll pick it up next week.
Shkayach.